Hey guys, tonight we're examining what happens when an entire society teaches young men that reputation matters more than safety, glory matters more than comfort, and backing down is worse than getting trampled by a horse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand why some medieval knights occasionally behaved like men conducting a long-term experiment to discover the limits of human judgment, we need to start when they were children. The making of a knight did not begin on a battlefield. It began in a nursery. If you were born into a noble family in medieval Europe, your future was often decided before you could speak in complete sentences. A peasant boy might inherit a field. A merchant's son might inherit a business. A noble boy was expected to become a warrior. Medieval society was not particularly interested in hearing that your true passion was pottery. At around 7 years old, many noble boys left home to serve as pages in another lord's household. Today, parents become concerned if a child spends too much time online. Medieval parents looked at a 7-year-old and thought, "Excellent. He seems old enough to begin preparing for mounted combat." Life as a page involved learning manners, religion, reading, riding horses, hunting, and serving important guests. It sounded civilized enough. Yet hidden beneath every lesson was the same message. Your worth depended largely on your ability to become an effective fighter. Even recreation pushed boys in that direction. Wooden swords were common toys. Mock battles were encouraged. Wrestling was admired. Meanwhile, activities involving caution, patience, and avoiding unnecessary danger received noticeably less attention. Medieval Europe was not accidentally producing knights. It was operating a remarkably efficient knight factory. Stories reinforced the process. Young noble boys grew up hearing tales of legendary warriors who charged into impossible situations and somehow emerged covered in glory instead of regret. King Arthur's knights, Charlemagne's heroes, and famous crusaders filled their imaginations. Nobody sat children down to tell thrilling tales about Sir Geoffrey the reasonably prepared, who carefully assessed the risks and lived to a comfortable old age. By their teenage years, pages became squires. This was where the training intensified. Squires maintained weapons, cared for horses, polished armour, and accompanied knights on military campaigns. Many witnessed violence, executions, raids and battles while still very young. For them, warfare was not an occasional event. It was part of the background scenery. At the same time, they learned that reputation was everything. A knight's honour affected his friendships, political influence, marriage prospects, and family standing. Being called brave could open doors throughout a kingdom. Being called a coward could follow a man for decades, like a particularly aggressive tax collector. The result was predictable. Young men learned that caution earned mockery. Boldness earned admiration. Recklessness sometimes earned songs. And songs were powerful things. Because by the time a young nobleman finally received his spurs and became a knight, he had spent more than a decade absorbing a single lesson. Glory was worth almost any risk, as we'll soon see. Giving thousands of ambitious young men that belief, and then handing them swords, war horses, and social status, produced exactly the kind of results you would expect, only with more chainmail. By the time a young man became a knight, he had already learned that courage was important. What he learned next was considerably more dangerous. He learned that honour was everything. In modern society, if someone insults you online, the recommended response is usually to ignore them, block them, or spend 3 seconds realizing their opinion changes absolutely nothing about your life. A medieval knight would have found this approach deeply confusing. For a knight, honor was not simply a matter of personal pride. It was a form of social currency. It affected business arrangements, political alliances, marriage opportunities, military leadership, and family prestige. Honor could open doors. Losing it could close them just as quickly. This created a world where even small insults could become surprisingly serious. Imagine attending a feast where another nobleman casually questions your bravery. Perhaps he suggests you were late arriving to a battle. Maybe he implies that another knight fought more courageously than you did. Perhaps he merely raises an eyebrow at an inconvenient moment. Today, most people would move on with their evening. A medieval knight might spend the next 6 months planning revenge. The problem was that honor existed largely in the eyes of others. If enough people believed an accusation, it could become reality regardless of whether it was true. This meant knights constantly felt pressure to defend their reputations. And defend them they did. Arguments frequently escalated into duels, feuds, or outright warfare. Noble families sometimes fought each other for years over disputes that began with insults, inheritance disagreements, or perceived slights. Entire regions could become unstable because two powerful men refused to admit that perhaps everyone involved was being unreasonable. Admitting fault was especially difficult. A knight who backed down risked appearing weak. A knight who escalated the situation could at least claim he was protecting his honor. This created a fascinating system where the most mature solution was often the least attractive option. The culture rewarded bold responses and punished restraint. As a result, many knights developed a habit of treating every challenge as a test of character. A disagreement became a matter of honor. A competition became a matter of honor. Someone looking at you incorrectly somehow became a matter of honor. Before long, honor had become less of a virtue and more of a full-time occupation. And unfortunately, there was one place where knights could demonstrate their honor in front of enormous crowds, gain fame, win prizes, and occasionally get trampled by horses. It was called a tournament, and it turned out to be one of the most effective ways ever invented to convince young noblemen that reckless behavior was an excellent idea. If honor was the fuel that powered the medieval knight, tournaments were the engine that burned through it at an alarming rate. At first glance, a tournament sounds harmless enough. Modern people hear the word and imagine organized competitions, clear rules, medical staff, and participants returning home with a trophy and perhaps a mild ankle injury. Medieval tournaments were slightly different. A better description might be large groups of heavily armed noblemen gathering in a field to settle absolutely nothing while risking their lives. Originally, tournaments were not even designed as entertainment. They functioned as military training exercises. Knights practiced riding, fighting, and working together under battlefield conditions. The problem was that knights quickly discovered they enjoyed the fighting part much more than the training part. Thousands of spectators often attended these events. Nobles, merchants, peasants, clergy, and travellers gathered to watch the action. Successful knights could gain wealth, fame, and admiration. They could attract powerful allies. They could improve their social standing. Some could even impress potential marriage partners. In other words, tournaments created a perfect environment for showing off, and knights rarely needed encouragement in that department. The most dangerous events were known as melees. Unlike the carefully choreographed jousts often shown in movies, melees involved large groups of knights fighting across open ground. Participants charged each other with lances, swung swords, wrestled opponents from horses, and attempted to capture rivals for ransom. The experience resembled a battle so closely that observers occasionally struggled to identify the difference. Injuries were common. Broken bones, Crushed limbs, concussions, and fatal accidents occurred regularly. Armour provided protection, but it could not completely compensate for the fact that dozens of armoured men were galloping toward each other while carrying weapons. Remarkably, this danger often increased the tournament's appeal. Knights earned prestige by demonstrating bravery. The greater the risk, the greater the potential glory. A cautious knight might survive the day, but he was unlikely to become famous. A reckless knight might become a legend, or a cautionary tale. Sometimes both simultaneously. Certain knights became obsessed with tournament success. They travelled across Europe seeking competitions, chasing victories the way modern athletes chase championships. Some spent enormous fortunes on horses, armour, servants and travel expenses. A few ruined themselves financially while trying to maintain their reputation. Because by now, many knights had developed a dangerous habit. They no longer wanted glory. They needed it. And that hunger for recognition would soon follow them far beyond the tournament field and into every corner of medieval life. By now, our medieval knight had spent years chasing honour and proving himself in tournaments. Unfortunately, there was one problem. The proving never stopped. A knight could win 10 battles, dominate 20 tournaments, and earn praise from kings, yet a single moment of hesitation could still damage his reputation. Medieval society had many admirable qualities, but it was not particularly forgiving when it came to perceived weakness. This created a strange psychological trap. Knights were expected to be brave at all times, not occasionally, not when circumstances were favourable, always. If a dangerous mission appeared, a knight was expected to volunteer. If an enemy challenged him, he was expected to respond. If a battle looked hopeless, he was expected to ride into it anyway. The concept of saying, "This seems unnecessary and potentially fatal," rarely generated applause. Many knights became trapped in a cycle of constant performance. Every public appearance felt like an examination. Every decision was observed by peers who were eager to judge courage, loyalty, and strength. And medieval nobles judged each other constantly. A knight's companions might forgive a military defeat. They might forgive bad luck. What they struggled to forgive was the appearance of fear. This helps explain some remarkably reckless decisions found throughout medieval history. Knights sometimes launched attacks against overwhelming odds because retreat seemed shameful. Others accepted duels they had little chance of winning because refusal could damage their standing. Some remained in hopeless battles long after common sense had packed its belongings and left. The pressure became especially intense among younger knights. Older warriors occasionally learned caution through experience. Younger men often had something to prove. A veteran knight might look at a dangerous situation and think, "I have seen enough battlefields to know this is a terrible idea." A 20-year-old knight might look at the same situation and think, "This could make me famous." History contains many examples of both approaches. The second group tends to be remembered more often. Literature made matters worse. Stories celebrated heroic last stands, impossible victories, and fearless warriors who never doubted themselves. Real knights consumed these stories enthusiastically. The fact that many legendary heroes were fictional did little to discourage imitation. After all, nobody writes epic poems about the nobleman who carefully assessed the situation, negotiated a peaceful solution, and returned home with all his limbs intact. The result was a culture where appearing fearless became almost as important as actually surviving. And when an entire class of warriors spends its life trying to prove it fears nothing, eventually some of them start believing it. That belief would become even more dangerous when religion entered the equation and promised rewards far beyond earthly glory. If tournaments encouraged knights to risk their lives for glory, religion offered something even more powerful. It offered eternal glory. For centuries, medieval Europe was deeply shaped by Christianity. Knights attended church, listened to sermons, donated to monasteries, and viewed much of life through a religious lens. Most genuinely believed that God played an active role in human affairs. Then, during the late 11th century, a remarkable idea began spreading across Europe. What if fighting could help save your soul? The concept reached its most famous expression during the Crusades. When Pope Urban II called for a military expedition to the Holy Land in 1095, he presented it not merely as a war, but as a sacred duty. For knights, this was a revolutionary development. Previously, violence had created a moral problem. Christianity valued peace, forgiveness, and humility. Knights, meanwhile, spent much of their lives hitting people with metal objects. Reconciling these two realities had always been somewhat awkward. The Crusades seemed to solve the issue. Now, a knight could fight, kill enemies, gain honour, earn fame, and potentially receive spiritual rewards at the same time. It was almost as if someone had designed a religious movement specifically tailored to the interests of heavily armed noblemen. Not surprisingly, many were enthusiastic. Thousands sold land, borrowed money, and left their homes to join crusading armies. Some travelled thousands of miles across unfamiliar territory, enduring disease, hunger, extreme weather, and constant danger. The journey itself could be brutal. Entire groups perished before ever reaching their destination. Yet many continued forward because they believed they were participating in a sacred mission. Religious devotion was certainly part of this motivation, but so was prestige. Crusaders often returned with enhanced reputations. Veterans gained admiration throughout Europe. Their stories attracted attention. Their experiences carried enormous social value. For ambitious knights, the appeal was obvious. A tournament might earn you local fame. A crusade could make you famous across Christendom. Unfortunately, this combination of faith, honour, and warfare sometimes produced extraordinary levels of confidence. Certain crusaders became convinced that divine favour guaranteed success. Others interpreted victories as proof that God approved of their decisions. A few developed expectations that reality would struggle to meet. History repeatedly demonstrated that arrows, disease, thirst, and poor planning were surprisingly indifferent to personal confidence. Yet the belief persisted, and once a knight became convinced that both society and heaven were cheering him forward, caution became even harder to justify. As we will see next, some warriors became so accustomed to conflict that they eventually stopped needing religion, honour, or tournaments as motivation. They simply discovered that peace itself had become the problem. For some medieval knights, war was a necessity. For others, it became a habit. And for a surprising number, it looked suspiciously like a hobby. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe contained thousands of trained warriors whose entire identities revolved around fighting. They had spent their childhood learning combat, their teenage years practicing combat, and their adult lives gaining status through combat. Then peace arrived. This created an unexpected problem. A knight without a war was a bit like a fisherman without water or a baker without flour. His skills still existed, but opportunities to use them had suddenly disappeared. Many struggled with this reality. A modern professional athlete might retire and take up golf. A medieval knight often looked around for the nearest conflict. Contemporary writers occasionally complained about this tendency. During peaceful periods, some knights became restless. Raiding, feuding, private warfare, and various forms of armed mischief often increased when there were no major campaigns available. The Church even attempted to address the issue. Movements such as the Peace of God and Truce of God tried to limit violence by restricting when knights could fight and whom they could attack. Church leaders essentially found themselves saying, "Please stop attacking people for at least part of the week." The fact that such rules were considered necessary tells us quite a lot. Part of the problem was economic. Maintaining knightly status was expensive. Horses, armour, weapons, servants, and estates required substantial resources. Warfare sometimes offered opportunities for loot, ransom money, land acquisition, and political advancement. Conflict could be profitable. Peace, unfortunately, rarely came with prize money. Part of the problem was psychological. Many knights genuinely enjoyed the excitement of warfare. Battle offered danger, purpose, camaraderie, and opportunities for recognition. It transformed ordinary men into heroes, or at least gave them a chance to try. Compared to that, managing estates and settling disputes between tenants could feel remarkably dull. Imagine spending your entire life training for dramatic acts of courage, only to discover your most urgent responsibility is determining who owns 3 goats and half a field. Not every knight adapted gracefully. Some actively sought opportunities for adventure. Others joined foreign wars. Many embraced Crusades partly because they provided an acceptable outlet for martial ambitions. The result was a warrior class that often viewed peace as an interruption rather than an achievement. And this mindset became particularly dangerous when combined with the endless rivalries of noble society. Because if there was one thing capable of keeping knights occupied during peacetime, it was finding new reasons to hate their neighbours. If medieval knights could not find a war, they were often perfectly capable of creating one, and usually they did not have to travel very far. The nearest enemy was often a neighbouring noble. Modern disputes between neighbours tend to involve fences, parking spaces, or the occasional disagreement about noise. Medieval noble disputes involved armed retainers, burning villages, and enough mutual hatred to keep several generations occupied. A feud could begin almost anywhere. A disputed inheritance, a contested border, a broken marriage agreement, an insult at a banquet, a hunting accident, a debt, or simply 2 powerful men deciding they disliked each other. Once started, these conflicts had an unfortunate tendency to grow. The problem was that medieval justice was often weak, inconsistent, or heavily influenced by local power. If a knight believed he had been wronged, he could not always rely on courts to solve the problem. As a result, many nobles preferred a more direct approach. That approach usually involved gathering armed men. Soon a dispute between 2 individuals could become a conflict involving entire families. Allies joined on both sides. Old grievances resurfaced. New grievances were created. Before long, nobody could remember exactly how the feud had started, but everyone remained committed to continuing it. This was particularly common among powerful noble houses. One generation might begin the conflict, the next generation inherited it, then their children inherited it as well. In some cases, people were risking their lives over arguments that had started before they were born. Remarkably, this often seemed completely reasonable to those involved. Honour demanded revenge. Revenge protected reputation. Reputation protected status. And status protected everything else. The logic was circular, but it was extremely popular. Castles played an important role in these disputes. They were not simply homes. They were military strongholds. A knight who felt threatened could retreat behind thick walls, gather supplies, and prepare for a siege. This sometimes turned local disagreements into lengthy military operations. Imagine arguing with your neighbour and responding by locking yourself inside a fortress while armed supporters gather outside. Medieval Europe occasionally operated on this principle. Some knights became so notorious for private warfare that even kings struggled to control them. Monarchs frequently issued orders demanding peace, only to discover that heavily armed nobles were surprisingly selective about which instructions they followed. The result was a landscape filled with rivalries, grudges, and vendettas, and while these feuds often caused enormous destruction, they also encouraged knights to see themselves as heroes in an ongoing drama. A drama that became even more dangerous when stories and legends convinced some warriors that they were destined to live like the heroes of old. By the time we reach this point in our story, our medieval knight has spent years defending his honour, fighting tournaments, joining feuds, and searching for glory. Unfortunately, there was another influence quietly shaping his worldview. Stories. Lots and lots of stories. Medieval Europe loved tales of heroic knights. Noble courts were filled with poems, songs, romances, and legends celebrating larger-than-life warriors who performed impossible deeds and never seemed to suffer from ordinary human limitations. The most famous examples were the stories surrounding King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. These tales featured brave heroes embarking on dangerous quests, defeating evil enemies, rescuing noble ladies, and achieving eternal fame through courage and virtue. The stories were entertaining. The problem was that some knights started treating them as career advice. Today, most people can watch an action movie without immediately attempting to jump between moving vehicles. Medieval knights did not always maintain this distinction between fiction and reality. Many genuinely tried to imitate the heroes they admired. Throughout Europe, noblemen adopted the language and customs of chivalric romances. They dedicated victories to noble ladies, sought opportunities for dramatic displays of bravery, and actively pursued adventures that resembled the stories they loved. Sometimes this was harmless. Sometimes it was deeply embarrassing. And occasionally, it was dangerous. One famous example occurred during the late Middle Ages, when knights began undertaking elaborate quests simply to prove their courage. Some swore strange public oaths. Others travelled enormous distances looking for worthy opponents. A few deliberately placed themselves in unnecessary danger because they believed heroic deeds would enhance their reputations. To modern observers, this can seem remarkably irrational. Yet from a knight's perspective, it made perfect sense. The heroes in the stories received admiration. The real knights wanted admiration. Therefore, the solution appeared obvious. Become the story. The trouble was that real life lacked many of the conveniences found in heroic romances. Dragons rarely appeared. Wise wizards were difficult to locate. Prophecies were unreliable. And enemies stubbornly refused to behave like supporting characters. Real battles involved mud, disease, exhaustion, and confusion. Real warfare rarely looked as elegant as the poem suggested. Still, the fantasy remained powerful. Many knights viewed themselves not simply as soldiers, but as protagonists in an epic narrative. Every tournament became a test. Every feud became a quest. Every battle became an opportunity for immortality. And when enough people begin believing they are the heroes of a grand story, something interesting happens. They start taking risks that ordinary people would wisely avoid. As we will soon discover, nowhere was this more dangerous than during the Crusades, where some knights carried these dreams of heroism far beyond the borders of Europe, and sometimes far beyond reality itself. The Crusades attracted some of the bravest knights in Europe. They also attracted some of the most optimistic. And optimism, while generally considered a positive quality, can become dangerous when combined with armour, religious certainty, and a horse. By this point, medieval knights had spent their entire lives receiving a very specific message. Be brave. Be honourable. Seek glory. Never back down. And if possible, do all of these things while someone is watching. The predictable result was that some knights developed levels of confidence that modern psychologists would find fascinating. History is filled with examples of warriors who willingly attacked forces several times larger than their own. Sometimes they succeeded and became legends. More often, they became lessons. One of the most famous examples occurred during the 100 Years' War between England and France. French knights were widely regarded as some of the finest warriors in Europe. They possessed excellent armour, powerful horses, noble lineage, and absolute confidence in their own abilities. Unfortunately, confidence occasionally proved less effective than arrows. At battles such as Crusades and Agincourt, heavily armoured French knights repeatedly charged English positions despite difficult terrain, poor visibility, and clear signs that things were not going well. The logic behind these attacks often made sense within knightly culture. Retreat was shameful. Hesitation was shameful. Waiting was suspiciously close to hesitation. Therefore, charging forward appeared to be the honourable option. The fact that hundreds of longbowmen were waiting ahead somehow failed to improve the plan. Again and again, knights chose courage over caution. Sometimes individual acts of bravery were genuinely astonishing. Chroniclers described knights continuing to fight after losing horses, suffering wounds, or becoming surrounded by enemies. Others refused opportunities to withdraw because they believed their reputation demanded they remain. From a modern perspective, this can seem irrational. From a medieval knight's perspective, reputation often outlived the body, and many cared deeply about what would be said about them after death. Stories circulated throughout Europe about warriors who had stood alone against impossible odds. Young knights grew up admiring these legends and naturally wanted their own place in history. The problem was that every generation remembered the rare heroes who survived impossible situations. They tended to forget the considerably larger number who did not. This created a dangerous form of historical optimism. A knight might hear 10 stories about glorious last stands. He rarely heard detailed accounts of the hundreds of men who attempted similar feats and were immediately introduced to reality. History remembers legends. It is less enthusiastic about remembering statistics. Yet, despite all the disasters, defeats, and painful lessons, many knights continued pursuing glory with unwavering determination. Because courage was only part of the equation. Status mattered too, and nowhere was status displayed more extravagantly than in the strange and often ridiculous world of knightly fashion. If you imagine medieval knights as practical soldiers concerned only with warfare, history has some disappointing news. Many of them were obsessed with fashion, not just mildly interested. Obsessed. This may seem surprising for men who regularly risked being hit with axes, but medieval knights cared enormously about appearance. Clothing, armour, horses, banners, and personal symbols all communicated status. And in a society where status meant everything, appearances became serious business. A knight's armour was not merely protection. It was a public statement. The finest armour required extraordinary skill to produce and enormous wealth to purchase. A magnificent suit of armour announced that its owner was powerful, successful, and important. In other words, it served much the same purpose as modern luxury cars, except it was significantly more effective during cavalry charges. Competition quickly followed. Knights decorated helmets with elaborate crests. They wore brightly coloured clothing beneath their armour. Shields displayed family symbols. Horses were covered in expensive fabrics embroidered with heraldic designs. The battlefield occasionally resembled a fashion exhibition that had taken a very unfortunate turn. As wealth increased during the High Middle Ages, noble competition intensified. Some knights began wearing clothing with sleeves so long they became impractical. Others favoured shoes with absurdly extended pointed toes. Certain fashions became so extravagant that authorities occasionally attempted to regulate them through laws. When governments start creating legislation about the length of your shoes, a trend has probably gone further than necessary. Yet the logic behind these displays was simple. Visibility created prestige. Prestige created influence. Influence created opportunities. A knight who looked impressive often received attention before he even spoke. Tournaments amplified this behaviour. These events were not only military competitions, they were social spectacles. Noble families gathered to observe, judge, and compare participants. Every knight wanted to stand out. As a result, many spent fortunes on equipment and appearances. Some borrowed heavily to maintain their image. Others invested extraordinary sums in horses, armour, clothing, and servants. A few nearly bankrupted themselves trying to look successful. The irony was difficult to miss. Knights often claimed to value courage, discipline, and virtue above all else. Yet many simultaneously devoted enormous energy to ensuring everyone admired their outfit. Human nature, it seems, has changed remarkably little. Beneath all the armour, banners, and decoration was a deeper issue. Knights did not simply want respect, they wanted glory. And that desire for personal fame would eventually push some warriors to make decisions so reckless that even their contemporaries questioned whether honour had finally overwhelmed common sense entirely. By the late Middle Ages, many knights were no longer fighting simply for land, money, or duty. They were fighting for something far less practical. They were fighting to be remembered. Glory had always been important in knightly culture, but over time it became almost an obsession. Noble families celebrated heroic ancestors. Poets praised famous warriors. Chronicles recorded great deeds. Songs immortalized victories. The message was clear. A man might die. A reputation could live forever. For ambitious knights, this was an extremely attractive idea. After all, medieval life offered no guarantees. Disease, warfare, accidents, and political intrigue could end a life unexpectedly. Fame, however, promised a form of immortality, at least in theory. As a result, many knights became deeply concerned with how future generations would view them. Would they be remembered as brave? Would they be remembered as honourable? Would their names survive long after their deaths? These questions influenced countless decisions. A cautious victory might secure a military objective. A dramatic charge might secure a place in history. Unfortunately, the second option often looked more appealing. This was especially true among younger nobles eager to establish their reputations. Many believed that extraordinary actions were necessary to distinguish themselves from hundreds of other knights competing for recognition. Ordinary success was respectable. Spectacular success was unforgettable. The problem was that spectacular success and spectacular failure often looked remarkably similar, until the outcome became clear. A knight who charged an enemy force and won became a hero. A knight who charged an enemy force and lost became an example. The decision itself was frequently identical. Throughout Europe, warriors made elaborate vows designed to demonstrate their courage. Some promised not to eat certain foods until completing a military objective. Others swore to undertake dangerous journeys or challenge formidable opponents. These public promises attracted attention. They also made retreat awkward. Once an entire court had heard your dramatic vow, changing your mind became socially complicated. No one wants to stand up and announce that after careful consideration, they have decided to pursue a safer and more sensible course of action. That is not the sort of statement that inspires ballads. The pursuit of glory also encouraged competition. If one knight performed a remarkable feat, Another knight felt pressure to surpass it. Reputation became a contest with no clear finish line. There was always another battle, another challenge, another opportunity to prove oneself, and sometimes, in the desperate pursuit of fame, certain knights crossed a line that even their fellow nobles found difficult to ignore. Because history contains more than a few examples of warriors whose behaviour was considered extreme not only by modern standards, but by medieval ones as well. Up to this point, we've talked about the culture that encouraged knights to behave recklessly. Now it's time to meet some of the individuals who took those ideas and pushed them far beyond what anyone could reasonably call normal. Because while medieval society certainly encouraged extreme behaviour, some knights managed to stand out even among their fellow warriors. And that is not an easy accomplishment when your profession already involves charging people with lances. One famous example was the English knight Sir John Hawkwood. Unlike the idealised heroes of chivalric stories, Hawkwood spent much of his career as a mercenary. He fought across Italy, switched employers when necessary, and built a reputation as one of the most feared military commanders of his age. To many nobles, loyalty was sacred. To Hawkwood, loyalty occasionally appeared negotiable. His success made him wealthy, but it also demonstrated how far reality had drifted from the romantic ideals celebrated in knightly literature. The age of heroic warriors was increasingly becoming the age of professional soldiers. Then there was Sir Gilles de Rais of France. At first, his career looked impressive. He fought alongside Joan of Arc and became one of the most celebrated nobles in France. But over time, his behaviour became increasingly disturbing and erratic. He squandered enormous fortunes, pursued bizarre schemes, and eventually became infamous for crimes so shocking that they horrified even his contemporaries. His downfall remains one of the darkest stories associated with the knightly class. Not every example was quite so grim. Some knights simply possessed astonishing levels of confidence. Consider the numerous nobles who issued dramatic challenges before battles, publicly promising victory against impossible odds. Others travelled across Europe seeking duels and adventures in pursuit of reputation. A few became so obsessed with proving their courage that they seemed incapable of recognising danger. The chroniclers often admired these men. They also occasionally sounded exhausted by them. Again and again, medieval writers describe warriors who ignored advice, rejected caution, and pursued glory regardless of the consequences. Sometimes these men achieved legendary success. Sometimes they created disasters. Often they managed both within the same lifetime. What makes these stories fascinating is that even medieval observers recognized the problem. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages were not blind to recklessness. Chroniclers frequently criticized arrogant nobles, mocked foolish decisions, and warned about excessive pride. They understood something that many knights struggled to accept. Courage and recklessness were not the same thing. Unfortunately, drawing that distinction becomes difficult when an entire culture rewards dramatic behaviour. And as Europe moved toward the end of the medieval period, reality was about to deliver a lesson that even the most stubborn knights could not ignore. The battlefield itself was changing. For centuries, knights had dominated European warfare. They were the military elite. They owned the best equipment, rode the finest horses, and occupied the highest positions in society. If a medieval knight had been asked who would control the future of warfare, his answer would almost certainly have been, "People exactly like me." History, however, had other plans. The first warning signs appeared long before the Middle Ages ended. At battles such as Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, armies of English longbowmen repeatedly devastated charging French knights. The results were deeply unsettling. For generations, Knights had believed that courage, noble birth, and superior equipment made them nearly unstoppable. Then they discovered that thousands of arrows had not received this information. A peasant archer could now kill a nobleman who had spent decades training for war. This was not how the system was supposed to work, yet the changes continued. Infantry became increasingly important. Professional soldiers became more common. Kings began building larger standing armies that relied less on individual knights and more on discipline, organisation, and logistics. Unfortunately for the knightly class, logistics has always been far less glamorous than heroism. Nobody writes epic poems about supply wagons arriving on schedule. Then came gunpowder. At first, firearms were crude, unreliable, and often as dangerous to the user as the enemy. Many knights viewed them with open contempt. This reaction was understandable. Imagine dedicating your entire life to mastering swordsmanship, horsemanship, and martial skill only to discover that a farmer with a primitive firearm could potentially ruin your day from a considerable distance. It felt unfair. Because it was. The old rules were disappearing. The battlefield increasingly rewarded coordination rather than individual bravery. A disciplined formation of infantry could stop a cavalry charge. Cannons could destroy castle walls that had stood for centuries. Firearms gradually reduced the advantages of expensive armour. The knight's world was changing faster than many knights could accept. Some adapted, others did not. Many continued clinging to the ideals of chivalry long after military reality had moved in a different direction. They still sought glory, personal honour, and dramatic displays of courage. The battlefield increasingly responded with mathematics. More arrows, more gunpowder, more disciplined soldiers, less romance. By the 16th century, the age of the knight was fading. The warrior aristocracy that had dominated Europe for hundreds of years was slowly losing its military importance. And perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: the culture that had encouraged knights to act like heroes ultimately collided with a new age that cared far less about heroics and far more about effectiveness. A lesson that brings us to the final question. Were medieval knights actually insane, or were they simply products of an insane system? So, after everything we've explored tonight, we arrive at the final question. Were medieval knights actually insane? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than it first appears. Most knights were not mad. They were not wandering through castles, speaking to invisible dragons, or attempting to joust with furniture. For the most part, they were intelligent people, operating exactly as their society expected them to operate. The real issue was the world that shaped them. Imagine growing up in a culture where your value depends on courage, where your reputation determines your future, where stories celebrate men who take extraordinary risks, where religion can reward warfare, where honour matters more than comfort, where backing down is humiliating, and where glory promises a form of immortality. Under those conditions, many of the decisions that seem irrational to us suddenly become understandable, not sensible, but understandable. The knight who charged a larger army was not necessarily crazy. He was following values that had been reinforced since childhood. The nobleman who spent years pursuing revenge was not necessarily irrational by medieval standards. He was protecting the reputation upon which his family's status depended. The crusader marching across continents was not simply seeking adventure. He genuinely believed he was participating in a sacred mission. What appears insane from one century often appears perfectly logical from another. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Because every society has its own version of common sense. The Romans believed civilization depended on conquering neighbours. The Vikings believed fame was worth almost any risk. The knights believed honor was worth almost any sacrifice. People rarely question the assumptions that surround them every day. They simply live inside them. The medieval knight was no different. Yet there is another reason these warriors continue to fascinate us centuries later. Despite all their flaws, contradictions, and spectacularly questionable decisions, they possessed qualities that remain admirable. Courage, determination, loyalty, discipline. The problem was that these virtues were often pushed to extremes, and almost every virtue becomes dangerous when taken far enough. Courage becomes recklessness. Confidence becomes arrogance. Loyalty becomes blind devotion. Honor becomes obsession. The story of the medieval knight is ultimately the story of human nature itself. A reminder that people are capable of extraordinary achievements and extraordinary mistakes, sometimes at exactly the same moment. And perhaps that is why knights still capture our imagination. Not because they were perfect heroes, but because they were very human. Just humans wearing 60 pounds of steel and making life-altering decisions at full gallop, which, history repeatedly demonstrated, was not always the ideal environment for careful reflection. And on that reassuring note, our journey through the wonderfully chaotic world of medieval knighthood comes to an end. Sleep well. Unlike a medieval knight, you probably don't need to wake up tomorrow and defend your honor before breakfast. Long before Roman soldiers landed on British shores, before straight roads cut across the countryside and towns appeared where forests once stood, Britain existed at the edge of the known world. To the people of the Mediterranean, this island seemed almost legendary. Greek merchants had heard stories about it for generations. Sailors spoke of distant coasts hidden beneath mist, of strange tribes living beyond the reach of familiar kingdoms, and of a place where the sea itself seemed to separate civilization from the unknown. Of course, Britain was not some magical land beyond the horizon. It was simply very far away, very wet, and occasionally difficult to find through the fog. Britain's landscape looked dramatically different from what we know today. Vast forests covered much of the countryside. Great stands of oak, ash, and elm stretched for miles across rolling hills and river valleys. Wolves prowled through the woods. Wild boar rooted through the undergrowth. Deer moved in large herds across open clearings. Travel was slow and often exhausting. There were no paved roads, no signposts, and certainly no helpful innkeeper waiting every few miles. Most journeys followed rivers, ancient tracks, or simple paths worn into the earth by generations of feet and livestock. The weather shaped nearly every aspect of life. Rain arrived frequently, and often at inconvenient moments, which was impressive considering almost every moment was inconvenient for someone. Winters were damp and uncomfortable. Summers could be pleasant one day and miserable the next. The climate demanded resilience from everyone who lived there. Yet Britain was far from empty. Across the island lived dozens of tribes, each controlling its own territory. Some occupied fertile farmland in the south. Others lived among the mountains of Wales or the rugged lands farther north. Every tribe had its own leaders, traditions, alliances, and rivalries. They shared similarities in language and culture, but they did not think of themselves as one people. There was no Britain in the political sense. There were only Britons. Small farming communities dotted the countryside. Hill forts crowned high ridges. Traders crossed the sea carrying goods from continental Europe. Farmers worked fields that their families had cultivated for generations. Warriors guarded tribal territories and sought glory in battle. To outsiders, the island seemed distant and mysterious. To those who lived there, it was simply the centre of the world. And for centuries, That world remained beyond the grasp of Rome. But across the Channel, a growing republic was beginning to look northward, and the age of isolation was slowly coming to an end. The Britain that existed before Rome was not a single kingdom, a united nation, or even a collection of friendly neighbours who gathered occasionally to discuss mutual concerns over a pleasant meal. It was a patchwork of tribes. Hundreds of years before Julius Caesar ever heard the name Britain, waves of Celtic-speaking peoples had gradually spread across the island. They did not arrive all at once as a giant migration. Instead, new groups, ideas, technologies and customs flowed into Britain over centuries, blending with the populations already living there. The result was a rich and diverse society that shared many cultural traits while remaining deeply divided. Each tribe controlled its own territory. The Catuvelauni dominated parts of southeastern Britain. The Iceni ruled lands in the east. The Brigantes held large areas farther north. In what is now Wales, several powerful tribes occupied the mountains and valleys. Beyond them lived peoples whom southern Britons often viewed as nearly as foreign as anyone from across the sea. Local identity mattered enormously. A person was not simply a Briton. They belonged to a specific tribe, clan, family, and community. Loyalty flowed first to relatives and local leaders rather than to any broader sense of national unity. If one tribe fought another, nobody was particularly surprised. In fact, many considered it perfectly normal. Peace was often treated as a temporary pause between arguments. Most people lived in small farming settlements scattered across the countryside. Roundhouses built from timber, wattle and thatch formed the centres of these communities. Families worked fields of barley and wheat, raised cattle and sheep, and stored food for the difficult winter months. Life revolved around the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer brought grazing and maintenance. Autumn required harvesting and preparation. Winter tested whether those preparations had been sufficient. Nature was not interested in excuses. Despite the importance of farming, tribal society was far from simple. Skilled metal workers produced impressive weapons and jewellery. Craftsmen created intricate designs that still amaze archaeologists today. Traders carried goods between regions, connecting distant communities long before formal roads existed. Above ordinary farmers stood nobles, warriors, and powerful families whose influence shaped tribal politics. Prestige came from wealth, military success, and the ability to attract followers. A respected leader might command dozens or even hundreds of warriors. A weak leader could quickly discover that loyalty often disappeared at the same speed as free gifts. These tribes would dominate Britain for centuries. But while they competed with one another, a far larger power was steadily expanding across Europe, drawing ever closer to their shores. As tribal populations grew and rivalries intensified, the landscape of Britain began to change. Across hills and ridges, enormous earthworks appeared. Massive banks of soil rose from the ground. Deep ditches carved through the countryside. Wooden palisades crowned defensive walls. From a distance, these sites looked like fortresses guarding entire regions. These were the hill forts of Iron Age Britain, and they were among the most impressive structures built anywhere in northern Europe before the arrival of Rome. To modern eyes, a hill fort might seem like an obvious military base. Certainly, defence played an important role. A steep hill surrounded by walls was far easier to defend than a village sitting in an open field, waiting politely for attackers to arrive. But hill forts were much more than forts. Many functioned as thriving communities, where hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of people lived and worked. Inside the walls stood roundhouses, storage buildings, workshops, animal enclosures, and gathering spaces. Some hill forts covered dozens of acres, creating bustling centres of tribal life. Imagine approaching one on a busy day. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Blacksmiths hammer glowing iron into tools and weapons. Farmers drive cattle through narrow gates. Traders arrive carrying goods from distant regions. Children run between houses while dogs bark at anything that moves, which in fairness was most things. The walls themselves required extraordinary labour. Without machinery or modern tools, communities dug massive ditches using simple equipment made from wood, iron, and determination. The soil removed from these ditches formed towering embankments. In some cases, multiple rings of defences surrounded the settlement, forcing any attacker to overcome obstacle after obstacle. The construction represented a huge investment of time and manpower. A hill fort was not merely a place to live. It was a statement. It announced the power, wealth, and organisation of the tribe that built it. Yet not every day involved preparing for war. Most residents spent their time on ordinary tasks. Women and men processed grain, cared for livestock, repaired tools, prepared meals, and maintained homes. Daily life remained centred on work, family, and survival. The fort simply provided security and community. It also offered protection during uncertain times. If raiders threatened nearby settlements, people could retreat behind the earthworks. Livestock could be brought inside. Supplies could be protected. The hill fort became a refuge as much as a stronghold. And within these walls, another form of power was taking shape. For behind every great hill fort stood leaders who controlled its warriors, wealth, and people. Their authority would shape the destiny of entire tribes. The hill forts of Britain did not build themselves. Someone had to organise the labour. Someone had to settle disputes over land, direct warriors during conflicts, and convince hundreds of people to cooperate on projects that might take years to complete. That responsibility usually fell to tribal leaders. The Romans would later call many of them kings, though the reality was often more complicated. These rulers were not kings in the later medieval sense. They did not sit on golden thrones issuing commands to obedient subjects. Their power depended heavily on personal reputation, wealth, and the loyalty of their followers. A tribal king ruled because people chose to follow him, and if they stopped following him, his position could become remarkably temporary. A successful leader needed several qualities. He had to be a capable warrior, since military strength remained essential in a world where neighbouring tribes could become enemies with very little notice. He also needed diplomatic skill. Alliances through marriage, trade agreements, and negotiated settlements often proved just as valuable as victories on the battlefield. Perhaps most importantly, a king needed generosity. Wealth was not something to hoard behind locked doors. A leader gained prestige by sharing it. Valuable weapons, livestock, jewellery, imported goods, and feasts all helped strengthen loyalty among warriors and nobles. A chief who rewarded his followers generously could expect support when trouble arrived. A chief who kept everything for himself often discovered that loyalty had limits. This was unfortunate, but also educational. The noble class occupied the layer below tribal rulers. These influential families controlled land, wealth, and armed followers. They advised leaders, managed local affairs, and competed constantly for status. Politics in Iron Age Britain could be surprisingly complex. Friendships, rivalries, marriages, and old grudges shaped decisions just as much as practical concerns, sometimes more. Powerful warriors formed another important part of society. Young men seeking status often attached themselves to respected leaders. They fought in battles, protected their chiefs, and hoped to earn wealth and reputation through acts of bravery. Stories of heroic deeds circulated widely. A warrior's reputation could travel farther than he ever did. Meanwhile, ordinary farmers supported the entire system through their labour. Crops, livestock, and trade goods provided the resources that allowed leaders to maintain influence and reward followers. At the centre of it all stood the tribal king, balancing alliances, managing disputes, and preparing for dangers both near and far. Because while political power depended on loyalty, it also depended on something else. The approval of forces far older than any king, the gods, the spirits, and the sacred traditions guarded by Britain's druids. While tribal kings negotiated alliances and warriors sought glory, most people in pre-Roman Britain lived much simpler lives. They farmed. In fact, nearly every aspect of society depended on agriculture. No matter how impressive a chief's hill fort might appear, nobody could eat prestige. Crops and livestock remained the foundation of survival. A typical farming family lived in a roundhouse made from wooden posts woven with branches and covered with clay. The roof consisted of thick thatch, which provided decent protection from the weather, assuming the weather was feeling cooperative that day. Britain rarely made such promises. Inside, a central fire burned almost constantly. Smoke drifted upward through the roof, though not all of it escaped. The interior could be dark, smoky, and crowded. Families cooked, ate, worked, and slept within the same structure. Animals might even be sheltered nearby during harsh weather. Privacy was not a major feature of Iron Age architecture. Most days revolved around the seasons. During spring, fields were prepared and planted. Summer required endless maintenance of crops and livestock. Autumn brought the vital harvest. Winter became a test of whether all that hard work had been enough. Failure carried serious consequences. A poor harvest could mean hunger. Consecutive poor harvests could threaten entire communities. Unlike modern supermarkets, ancient Britain offered very limited opportunities to complain to management. Livestock represented wealth as much as food. Cattle held particular importance and often served as a measure of status. Sheep provided wool for clothing, while pigs supplied valuable meat. Animals required constant attention and protection from disease, theft, and predators. Yet farming was only part of daily life. Across Britain, skilled craftsmen practiced trades that demanded years of experience. Blacksmiths transformed iron into tools, weapons, and household items. Their work was essential. Iron axes cleared forests. Iron ploughs improved farming. Iron spears helped settle disagreements in the traditional manner. Metal workers also created beautiful jewellery and decorative objects. Intricate torques, brooches, and ornaments demonstrated remarkable craftsmanship. Many surviving examples reveal a sophisticated artistic culture that surprised later Roman observers. Weaving formed another critical industry. Women often spent countless hours producing cloth from wool. Clothing required enormous effort from start to finish, making every garment valuable. Trade connected these communities together. Farmers exchanged surplus goods, craftsmen sold their products, and merchants carried items between distant regions. Life was demanding, repetitive, and heavily dependent on nature. Yet beneath these daily routines existed a deeper world of beliefs and traditions. For the people of Britain, the landscape itself seemed alive with sacred power, and no one understood that power better than the Druids. To the people of pre-Roman Britain, the world was not divided into the natural and the supernatural. Everything was connected. Rivers, forests, mountains, animals, and even certain stones could possess spiritual significance. The landscape was not merely a place where people lived. It was a living part of their beliefs, filled with unseen forces that influenced daily life. At the centre of this sacred world stood the Druids. Much of what we know about them comes from Roman writers, who were often fascinated, confused, or occasionally horrified by Celtic customs. As a result, separating fact from exaggeration can be difficult. The Romans were excellent engineers and administrators, but they were not always the most unbiased observers when describing foreign religions. What seems clear is that Druids held enormous influence. They were priests, teachers, judges, historians, and advisors all at once. In many tribes, their authority extended beyond that of kings in certain matters. While rulers controlled warriors and territory, Druids guarded knowledge and tradition, and knowledge was power. Unlike later societies that relied heavily on written records, the peoples of Britain preserved much of their history through memory and oral tradition. Druids spent years mastering vast amounts of information. They learned laws, genealogies, religious teachings, and stories passed down through generations. Training could take decades. Apparently, becoming a druid required considerably more study than becoming a warrior, which may explain why more young men chose the sword. Religious ceremonies often took place outdoors rather than inside temples. Sacred groves held particular importance. Certain forests were believed to be places where the human and divine worlds met. Rivers and lakes also attracted offerings. Archaeologists have discovered weapons, jewellery, and valuable objects deliberately placed in water. These were not accidents. Such items were gifts to supernatural powers, surrendered in hopes of gaining favour, protection, or success. The changing seasons shaped religious life as well. Festivals marked important moments in the agricultural year. Communities gathered to celebrate harvests, welcome summer, or prepare for winter. These events combined religion, social gatherings, feasting, and trade into occasions that strengthened tribal identity. People sought guidance from omens, rituals, and traditional beliefs. Before major decisions, leaders often consulted druids for advice. Their approval could lend legitimacy to political actions and military campaigns. In many ways, the druids helped hold society together. But while spiritual traditions united communities, another force was quietly connecting Britain to the wider world. Across the sea, merchants were arriving with foreign goods, new ideas, and news from lands far beyond the horizon. For an island supposedly located at the edge of the known world, pre-Roman Britain was surprisingly well connected. The sea that separated Britain from continental Europe was not a barrier. It was a highway. Long before Roman armies appeared, merchants crossed the channel carrying goods, ideas, and stories between distant communities. Every voyage brought new opportunities, new risks, and occasionally new misunderstandings between people who did not share a language but were equally interested in making a profit. Some things never change. Trade linked Britain to networks stretching across much of Europe. The island possessed resources that foreign merchants wanted, particularly tin. This metal was essential for producing bronze, and Britain contained some of the richest tin deposits in Europe. Cornwall became especially important. Tin mined there could travel hundreds of miles through trading networks, eventually reaching places that most Britons would never see. A piece of metal extracted from a British hillside might pass through dozens of hands before ending up in a workshop near the Mediterranean. Other exports included livestock, animal hides, hunting dogs, wool, and possibly slaves. While uncomfortable to discuss today, slavery existed throughout much of the ancient world and formed part of many trading systems. In return, foreign merchants brought luxury goods. Fine pottery arrived from Gaul. Wine from southern Europe appeared in the homes of wealthy tribal leaders. Decorative jewellery, glass beads, and finely crafted metalwork found eager buyers among Britain's elite. Imported goods carried prestige. A chief serving Mediterranean wine at a feast was demonstrating wealth and influence. He was showing that he possessed connections extending far beyond neighbouring tribes. Nothing impressed guests quite like drinking an expensive imported beverage while discussing how important one's tribe had become. Trade also spread ideas. Foreign travellers brought news of distant wars, powerful kingdoms, and technological innovations. Britons learned about developments occurring across Europe, while continental merchants carried stories about Britain back to their own communities. Ports and trading centres gradually became gathering places where different cultures met. Languages mixed, customs were exchanged, alliances formed, occasionally disputes erupted. Human beings have always managed to combine commerce and arguments with remarkable efficiency. As wealth increased, competition intensified. Control of valuable trade routes brought power. Access to imported goods enhanced prestige. Successful leaders attracted more followers and greater influence. But prosperity also created tension. The more wealth a tribe possessed, the more attractive it became as a target. Rival communities watched one another closely, and old disputes could quickly become violent. Because beneath the trade agreements and diplomatic exchanges, Iron Age Britain remained a warrior society where conflict was never very far away. Trade brought wealth to Britain, but wealth often brought something else as well. Envy. Across the island, tribes competed constantly for land, resources, prestige, and influence. Alliances formed and dissolved. Friendships lasted until they became inconvenient. Old feuds could survive for generations, patiently waiting for a new excuse to begin again. War was a familiar part of life. This did not mean Britain existed in a constant state of chaos. Most people spent their lives farming, raising families, and trying to survive the weather. But conflicts between tribes occurred often enough that nearly every community understood the importance of warriors and defence. A successful warrior enjoyed considerable status. Bravery in battle earned respect, rewards, and stories that might be retold for years. Young men seeking prestige often joined the retinues of tribal leaders, hoping to prove themselves through courage and skill. A reputation for fearlessness could open doors that wealth alone could not, assuming one survived long enough to enjoy it. Weapons varied throughout Britain. Spears were common and practical. Swords served as symbols of status as much as tools of war. Shields protected warriors in combat and often displayed intricate designs representing tribal identities. Many warriors carried equipment they or their families had invested significant resources to obtain. Iron was valuable. A warrior's weapons represented not only military strength, but also social standing. One of the most distinctive features of British warfare was the use of chariots. By the time the Romans arrived, chariots had largely disappeared from Mediterranean battlefields, but some British tribes continued to use them. Roman observers were fascinated. A warrior might ride into battle aboard a light chariot driven by a skilled charioteer. At the right moment, he would leap from the vehicle, fight on foot, and then return to the moving chariot when needed. To Roman soldiers, encountering this tactic for the first time, it must have seemed both impressive and slightly unreasonable. The British apparently considered it perfectly normal. Most conflicts were not massive battles involving entire nations. Instead, warfare often consisted of raids, ambushes, cattle thefts, and limited engagements between rival groups. Capturing livestock could be as valuable as winning territory. In a farming society, stealing a herd of cattle could cripple an enemy while enriching your own tribe. Yet, as dangerous as neighbouring tribes could be, a far greater threat was emerging across the Channel. The Roman Republic had conquered vast territories throughout Europe. Its armies were growing stronger every year. Soon, Britain would no longer be merely a distant island at the edge of the world. It would become a target. For centuries, the tribes of Britain had lived beyond the reach of the Mediterranean world's greatest powers. Empires rose and fell far to the south. Kings fought wars. Cities grew wealthy. Armies marched across continents. Meanwhile, Britain remained Britain. Its tribes traded with Europe, heard rumours from distant lands, and occasionally welcomed foreign merchants into their ports. Yet for most people, Rome was little more than a name attached to stories carried across the sea. That was beginning to change. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic had become the dominant power in Western Europe. Under ambitious generals, Roman armies conquered vast territories. One by one, independent peoples fell beneath Roman rule. Not every Viking warrior became a berserker. In fact, most did not. The men who earned that fearsome reputation occupied a special place within Norse society. They were admired, feared, celebrated, and occasionally avoided by the very people they protected. Stories described them as fighters who seemed to transform in battle, casting aside pain, caution, and sometimes common sense altogether. But long before a warrior entered his first battle frenzy, he was simply a boy growing up in Scandinavia. His childhood would not have looked particularly unusual. He lived on a farm or in a small settlement surrounded by forests, mountains, and cold seas. From an early age, he learned skills necessary for survival. He helped care for animals, gathered firewood, fished, hunted, and worked alongside his family. Life offered little room for laziness. The Scandinavian climate had a remarkable ability to punish poor preparation. Winter arrived every year with the consistency of an unpaid tax collector. Children learned quickly that strength and endurance mattered. Young boys spent countless hours outdoors. They climbed rocky slopes, crossed icy streams, rowed boats, and accompanied older men on hunting expeditions. These activities built physical toughness, but they also taught something equally important: self-control. A warrior who panicked was dangerous to everyone around him. As boys entered adolescence, martial training became increasingly important. They practiced with wooden weapons before graduating to real ones. Spears, axes, shields, and knives became familiar tools. Wrestling matches tested strength and determination. Competitions between young men helped identify those who possessed unusual courage or aggression. Certain personalities stood out. Some boys displayed an exceptional willingness to face danger. Others seemed almost drawn to conflict. They demonstrated fearlessness during hunts, endurance during hardship, and an unusual intensity when competing against their peers. Such traits attracted attention. In a culture that valued warriors, these young men often gained reputations long before reaching adulthood. Elders observed them. Local leaders noticed them. Stories about their exploits circulated through settlements. At the same time, Norse society viewed battle differently than many modern people do. Courage was not simply admired, it was expected. Honour, reputation, and bravery formed the foundation of a man's standing within the community. For a select few, ordinary courage was not enough. They sought something greater, something darker. As they matured, certain warriors became associated with powerful beliefs surrounding Odin, the god who ruled over wisdom, war, death, and the mysterious forces that shaped the fate of men. And it was through Odin that the path of the berserker truly began. If a young Norseman showed promise as a future warrior, his education did not take place in a special military academy. It took place everywhere. The farm, the forest, the fishing boat, the hunting trail, and the mead hall all served as classrooms. Viking society was built around survival, and survival required strength, skill, and resilience. Every task prepared a young man for challenges he would eventually face as an adult. Whether he intended to become a berserker or not, by his early teenage years, a boy was expected to contribute meaningfully to his household. He might spend long days cutting timber, repairing fences, tending livestock, or helping construct boats. These activities demanded endurance rather than bursts of effort. There were no motivational posters. There was simply work that needed to be done. And if it was not done, everyone suffered. The physical demands of daily life naturally created strong young men. Carrying water, rowing heavy vessels, hauling fishing nets, and working fields built muscles long before formal combat training became serious. Yet physical strength alone was not enough. A future warrior also needed mental toughness. Scandinavian life regularly tested a person's ability to endure discomfort. Cold weather, storms, food shortages, and dangerous travel were common realities. Complaining accomplished very little. The snow did not care about your feelings, and the North Sea was even less interested. Young men learned to accept hardship as a normal part of existence. Hunting played an important role as well. Tracking animals through forests required patience, observation, and discipline. A successful hunter learned how to remain calm under pressure and react quickly when opportunities appeared. These same skills proved useful in combat. Training with weapons gradually became more serious as boys matured. Wooden practice weapons gave way to iron blades and heavier shields. Sparring matches helped develop coordination and courage. Wrestling remained particularly important because it taught balance, strength, and determination. More importantly, it revealed character. A young man who gave up easily earned little respect. One who remained calm during defeat often gained admiration. Viking society valued perseverance almost as much as victory. Stories also shaped future warriors. Around fires and inside mead halls, boys listened to tales of heroes, explorers, kings, and legendary fighters. These stories provided examples of ideal behavior. Courage, loyalty, and honor appeared again and again. Among these stories were tales of unusual warriors, men who fought with terrifying intensity, men who seemed touched by powers beyond ordinary understanding, men whose names inspired both admiration and unease. The young warrior hearing those stories could hardly know it yet, but many believed such men drew their strength from the most mysterious god in the Norse world, Odin himself. For most Viking warriors, battle was a practical reality. You fought because your chief demanded it. You fought to protect your family, defend your land, gain wealth, or settle disputes that diplomacy had failed to solve. Combat was dangerous, but it was also part of life. For the men who became berserkers, however, war carried a deeper meaning. It was spiritual. Many scholars believe that berserkers were closely connected to the worship of Odin, the most complex and mysterious figure in Norse mythology. Unlike Thor, who was straightforward and popular, Odin was a god of contradictions. He ruled over wisdom and madness, poetry and death, magic and warfare, knowledge and chaos. If Thor was the dependable protector everyone wanted beside them during a storm, Odin was the unsettling stranger who asked uncomfortable questions and somehow knew the answer before you spoke. To Vikings, Odin was not merely a war god. He was the god who understood sacrifice. According to Norse myth, Odin willingly hung himself from the world tree for 9 days and nights to gain hidden knowledge. He sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. Again and again, the stories portrayed him as a figure willing to endure suffering in pursuit of greater power. Many warriors admired this, but certain warriors sought to imitate it. These men believed that by dedicating themselves to Odin, they could gain access to special strength, courage, or spiritual power. Some scholars suggest that berserkers may have belonged to warrior cults devoted to the god, groups that blended religious devotion with military training. While evidence remains limited, medieval sources repeatedly connect berserkers with Odin's influence. The connection was not accidental. Odin himself was often associated with battle frenzy. He could inspire overwhelming courage in his chosen warriors while bringing terror and confusion upon their enemies. Victory and defeat both rested in his hands. This belief shaped how certain fighters viewed combat. A normal warrior might fear death. A warrior devoted to Odin sought to embrace it. After all, those who died bravely could hope to enter Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where fallen warriors feasted, trained, and prepared for Ragnarök. For a young man raised on such stories, death in battle could appear less frightening than dying peacefully in bed. A peaceful death offered comfort. A glorious death offered immortality. As a result, warriors associated with Odin often cultivated fearlessness to an extreme degree. They trained themselves to ignore pain, suppress hesitation, and confront danger head-on. But devotion alone did not create a berserker. To truly become one, a warrior had to undergo rituals and transformations that blurred the line between man, beast, and legend. A berserker was not simply a warrior who fought aggressively. Viking society already had plenty of those. The men described in sagas and later chronicles stood apart because they appeared transformed. Witnesses spoke of fighters who seemed to abandon ordinary human behavior in battle, entering a state somewhere between religious ecstasy, animal fury, and absolute fearlessness. How exactly this transformation occurred remains one of history's great mysteries. The Vikings left no instruction manual titled How to Become a Berserker in 7 Easy Steps. As a result, historians must piece together clues from sagas, myths, and scattered references written centuries ago. What emerges is a picture of warriors who underwent both psychological and spiritual preparation. Religion likely played a central role. A warrior seeking Odin's favour may have participated in rituals designed to strengthen his bond with the god. These ceremonies could have involved prayers, sacrifices, chanting, or symbolic acts intended to separate him from ordinary society. The goal was not simply to become stronger, the goal was to become different. Many warrior cultures throughout history have used rituals to reshape identity. Before entering battle, fighters often perform ceremonies that reinforce courage and suppress fear. The ritual itself creates a mental shift. It tells the participant that he is no longer merely a farmer, hunter, or fisherman. He is now a warrior. For berserkers, this transformation may have gone much further. Some scholars believe they deliberately cultivated altered states of consciousness. Repetitive chanting, rhythmic drumming, intense dancing, controlled breathing, sleep deprivation, or prolonged fasting have all been suggested as possible methods. None can be proven with certainty. Yet such practices appear in warrior traditions across many cultures and could help explain the extraordinary behaviour described in Norse sources. The sagas often portray berserkers as entering battle in a state of overwhelming intensity. Before combat, they became restless, agitated, and emotionally charged. Their breathing quickened. Their focus narrowed. Everything beyond the coming fight seemed to disappear. Modern psychology would recognize some of these effects immediately. the human body is capable of remarkable changes under extreme stress or excitement. Adrenaline can dull pain, increase strength, and create tunnel vision. Fear can vanish beneath a wave of focused aggression. To Viking observers, however, something more profound was occurring. They believed the warrior was being touched by forces beyond the ordinary world. A man was becoming something else. And nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the animals with which berserkers chose to identify: the mighty bear and the feared wolf, creatures whose spirits they hoped to carry into battle. The transformation of a berserker did not end with rituals. It was also reflected in appearance. Throughout the Norse world, animals carried powerful symbolic meaning. They were not simply creatures that lived in forests or hunted across mountains. They represented qualities that humans admired, feared, and sometimes hoped to possess themselves. For berserkers, two animals stood above all others: the bear and the wolf. The very word berserker may come from a term meaning bear shirt, referring to warriors who wore bear skins into battle. Other elite fighters, known as Ulfhednar, were associated with wolves and reportedly wore wolf pelts instead. To modern eyes, this might seem like unusual fashion. To the Vikings, it carried profound significance. The bear was one of the most powerful animals known in Scandinavia. Large, intelligent, and immensely strong, it commanded respect wherever it roamed. A cornered bear could be terrifyingly dangerous. It fought with relentless determination and seemed almost impossible to intimidate. These were exactly the qualities a warrior wanted to project. The wolf represented something different. Where bears symbolized raw strength, wolves embodied cunning, endurance, and coordinated aggression. Wolves hunted in packs, pursued prey over long distances, and struck with deadly efficiency when opportunities appeared. Both animals occupied an important place within Norse mythology. Odin himself maintained strong associations with wolves. His companions Geri and Freki accompanied him throughout the myths. Wolves also appeared repeatedly in stories involving fate, battle, and destruction. By wearing animal skins, berserkers may have been doing more than displaying trophies. They may have been symbolically adopting the characteristics of these creatures. In many ancient cultures, warriors believed that animal spirits could lend strength, courage, or protection. The boundary between human and beast was often viewed differently than it is today. Through ritual, costume, and belief, a warrior could attempt to take on the qualities of a powerful predator. The skin became more than clothing. It became part of an identity. Imagine facing such a warrior on the battlefield. A man draped in the hide of a bear, shouting battle cries, showing little concern for danger, and advancing with apparent fearlessness. Whether or not supernatural forces were involved almost became irrelevant. The psychological effect alone would have been significant. Fear can be a weapon. And berserkers understood that as well as anyone. By the time they entered combat, they wanted enemies to see not a man but a force of nature. Something wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. Because soon, these warriors would be expected to prove that reputation in service to kings and chieftains whose survival often depended on the courage of a select few elite fighters. By the time a berserker had earned his reputation, he was no longer simply another fighter standing in a shield wall. He had become part of an elite group. The most powerful kings and chieftains of Scandinavia surrounded themselves with professional warriors known as a herd, a personal retinue bound together by loyalty, reward, and mutual dependence. These men formed the military heart of a ruler's power. Among them, berserkers often occupied a special position, at least when they were not terrifying everyone nearby. Membership in a king's household brought significant advantages. A warrior could receive valuable gifts, weapons, fine clothing, silver, and even land. Successful service offered opportunities for wealth that ordinary farmers could rarely imagine. A king invested heavily in his best fighters. After all, when enemies appeared on the horizon, a generous gift seemed much cheaper than losing a battle. Life inside the herd revolved around discipline and readiness. Warriors trained together, travelled with their leader, attended feasts, and participated in expeditions. Some spent years accompanying their chieftain across Scandinavia and beyond. The bond between ruler and warrior was extremely important. A good king rewarded loyalty. A good warrior defended his king. If either failed in those duties, the relationship tended to end badly. Often, very badly. Berserkers brought unique value to these warrior bands. Their reputation alone could intimidate rivals. Stories of their battlefield exploits spread rapidly through Norse society. Enemies who heard that a king's force included berserkers might think twice before seeking confrontation, or at least think once. Yet their status came with enormous expectations. A berserker was expected to lead from the front. When battle began, nobody wanted to hear excuses about poor weather, sore muscles, or a sudden interest in peaceful negotiation. Elite warriors were expected to display extraordinary courage under pressure. Their reputation demanded it. Many sagas describe berserkers as bodyguards protecting rulers during dangerous situations. Others portray them as shock troops unleashed at critical moments of battle. Whether every story is historically accurate remains uncertain, but the image is consistent. These men were expected to go where the fighting was fiercest. The role carried prestige, but it also carried danger. Elite warriors often suffered the highest casualties because they faced the greatest risks. Fame and glory were available, but neither came with a particularly generous retirement plan. Still, many considered the risk worthwhile. Because for a berserker, honour mattered more than safety, and sooner or later, every warrior had to prove himself where reputation truly counted. On the battlefield itself, in the terrifying moment when the legendary berserker rage finally emerged. Everything in a berserker's life led to this moment. The years of training, the devotion to Odin, the rituals, the animal symbolism, the endless pursuit of courage and reputation. All of it was preparation for the state that made berserkers legendary throughout the Norse world. The rage. According to the sagas, a berserker did not enter battle like an ordinary warrior. Before combat, witnesses described dramatic changes in behaviour. The warrior became restless and agitated. His breathing grew heavier. His eyes seemed fixed on something invisible to everyone else. Then the transformation began. The Icelandic sagas claim that berserkers fought with extraordinary ferocity. Some accounts describe them roaring like wild animals. Others claim they ignored wounds that would have stopped normal men. Enemies supposedly struggled to frighten them, while allies often gave them a respectful amount of personal space, which was probably a wise decision. One saga describes berserkers as being mad as dogs or wolves. Another claims they bit their shields before battle. Whether every detail is true is impossible to know, but the consistency of these descriptions suggests that something unusual was occurring. The question is what? For centuries, historians have debated the source of the berserker rage. Some have suggested religious ecstasy. Others point toward intense psychological conditioning. A few theories propose the use of intoxicating substances, though evidence remains limited and highly disputed. Modern scholars generally favour explanations involving a combination of ritual preparation, extreme emotional arousal, and cultural expectations. After all, Human beings can enter remarkable mental states under the right circumstances. Soldiers throughout history have described experiences in combat where fear vanished, pain seemed distant, and time itself appeared to slow down. Adrenaline can dramatically alter perception. Training can override hesitation. Belief can push individuals far beyond what they normally consider possible. The berserkers may have mastered these effects better than anyone else in Viking society. More importantly, everyone expected them to do so. A warrior who spent years building a reputation as a fearless servant of Odin could not easily retreat when battle arrived. His identity depended on living up to the legend, and legends have their own kind of power. Whether the rage came from divine inspiration, psychology, or a combination of both, its impact was undeniable. Stories of berserkers spread across Scandinavia and beyond. Their reputation grew with every retelling. Yet admiration was only part of the picture. For all their glory, berserkers also inspired fear, not just among their enemies, sometimes among their own people as well. The berserker rage earned admiration. It also earned fear. In Viking society, those two things often travelled together. A warrior who could charge into battle without hesitation, stand firm against overwhelming odds, and terrify his enemies naturally attracted respect. Chiefs wanted such men in their service. Kings valued them as bodyguards and champions. Poets celebrated their exploits in stories that could survive for generations. But there was a problem. The qualities that made berserkers useful in war could make them dangerous in peace. Most Viking warriors understood limits. They fought when necessary and returned to ordinary life afterward. They farmed, traded, attended assemblies, raised families, and settled disputes through established customs. Berserkers occupied a more uncertain place. The sagas often portray them as unpredictable figures. Some stories describe them as loyal heroes. Others present them as bullies, troublemakers, or men who struggled to fit comfortably within society. In these tales, berserkers sometimes challenged rivals to duels, intimidated weaker individuals, or used their fearsome reputations to get what they wanted. Whether these stories reflected reality or later exaggeration is difficult to know. What matters is that the reputation existed. People believed berserkers could be dangerous even when no battle was taking place. This created a complicated relationship with the wider community. Villagers might admire a famous berserker's courage while simultaneously hoping he remained several villages away. His presence offered protection, but it could also bring tension. It was rather like owning a guard bear, very effective, potentially inconvenient. Reputation became one of a berserker's greatest weapons. News travelled quickly throughout the Norse world. Merchants, sailors, warriors and travellers carried stories from settlement to settlement. Every victory enhanced a warrior's standing. Every tale grew slightly larger with each retelling. Soon, reality and legend began to merge. A warrior who won a difficult fight might become a man who defeated 10 opponents. A fierce battle might become an impossible triumph against overwhelming odds. Human beings have always enjoyed improving a good story, especially after several cups of mead. As these legends spread, berserkers became larger than life. They represented the ideal of absolute fearlessness. Young warriors admired them. Enemies dreaded them. Poets immortalized them. Yet reputations, no matter how powerful, cannot last forever. Over time, Scandinavian society began to change. Kings consolidated power. Christianity spread across the north. New laws and values emerged. The world that had created the berserkers was slowly disappearing, and with it, the legendary warriors themselves would begin to fade into history, leaving behind one final question. What became of the berserkers after the Viking Age ended? For centuries, berserkers stood among the most feared warriors in northern Europe. Kings valued them, enemies dreaded them, stories celebrated them. Yet by the end of the Viking Age, the berserkers began to disappear. Not because they lost their courage, not because they forgot how to fight. The world around them changed. When most people imagine the witch hunts, they picture a dark village where an innocent woman is suddenly accused of flying through the night on a broomstick. The reality was far more complicated and far more frightening. The witch hunts did not begin because people suddenly lost their minds. They emerged from a world already filled with fear, uncertainty, and genuine hardship. To understand why thousands of people were accused of witchcraft, you first have to step into the lives of ordinary Europeans living between the 15th and 17th centuries. Life was difficult. A harvest could fail without warning. Disease could sweep through a town in a matter of weeks. Livestock could die. Children could become sick overnight. Storms could destroy crops that represented an entire year's work. And nobody knew why. Today we have meteorology, medicine and science to explain many disasters. Early modern Europeans had far fewer answers. When tragedy struck, people searched desperately for explanations. Human beings are remarkably uncomfortable with randomness. If a cow suddenly died, there had to be a reason. If a child became ill, there had to be a cause. If hail destroyed the harvest while the neighbouring village remained untouched, someone had to be responsible. The idea that bad things simply happened without purpose felt deeply unsatisfying. Religion shaped these beliefs as well. Europe was overwhelmingly Christian, and people viewed the world through a spiritual lens. God, angels, demons, miracles, and the devil were not abstract concepts. They were real forces influencing daily life. Most people believed Satan actively sought to corrupt humanity. According to religious teachings, demons could tempt, deceive, and harm the faithful. If God worked through miracles, then the devil could work through witchcraft. At least that was the fear. As religious tensions intensified during the Reformation, anxiety grew even stronger. Catholics and Protestants accused one another of spreading evil. Wars erupted. Communities divided. Trust became fragile. People grew suspicious. Neighbours watched neighbours. Old arguments resurfaced. Long-standing grudges found new opportunities. The perfect conditions for witch hunts were slowly taking shape. Ironically, many of the people most afraid of witches had never actually met one, because there were no organised groups of secret witches gathering in forests to plot the downfall of Europe. What existed instead was something far more dangerous. A population frightened by hardship, convinced that invisible evil was everywhere, and desperate to find someone to blame. Once that fear took hold, accusations became easier than evidence. And that is exactly when the witch hunts truly began. As fear spread through Europe, people began looking for someone to blame. The question was simple. If witches were causing misfortune, who were they? The answer, unfortunately, depended less on evidence and more on suspicion. One of the biggest misconceptions about the witch hunts is that every victim was an old woman living alone in a cottage deep in the woods. While such individuals were certainly accused, the reality was much more complicated. The accused came from all walks of life. Most were women, but not all. Historians estimate that roughly 3/4 of those accused in Europe were female. That still leaves thousands of men who also found themselves standing before judges, trying to prove they had not entered into a pact with the devil. Witchcraft accusations followed patterns, but they were never completely predictable. Women were often targeted because of prevailing beliefs about gender. Religious authorities and scholars frequently portrayed women as spiritually weaker, more vulnerable to temptation, and therefore more likely to be corrupted by Satan. This idea sounds absurd today. At the time, many educated people considered it perfectly reasonable. Widows were especially vulnerable. Without husbands to defend them, they often occupied uncertain social positions within their communities. Many lived alone and relied on neighbours for support. Unfortunately, dependence could quickly become suspicion. If a widow asked for food and was refused, then later a family's cow died, some might wonder whether a curse had followed the disagreement. The human brain has always been exceptionally talented at connecting unrelated events. Healers and folk practitioners faced similar risks. Many communities relied on local women who prepared herbal remedies, assisted during childbirth, or treated common illnesses. Most were respected, until something went wrong. If a patient recovered, the healer received praise. If a patient died, questions began. The same knowledge that once earned trust could suddenly inspire fear. Outsiders were also frequent targets. New arrivals lacked family connections and long-established reputations. They seemed unfamiliar. They behaved differently. In anxious communities, unfamiliarity often created suspicion. Even personality could become dangerous. People known for arguments, unusual behaviour, or social awkwardness sometimes attracted unwanted attention. A neighbour who constantly quarrelled with others might eventually find every misfortune blamed on them. What made the witch hunts especially tragic was that many accusations started with ordinary human conflicts. Arguments over property, family disputes, failed romances, business rivalries, simple grudges. Yet once accusations entered the legal system, personal disagreements transformed into something far more dangerous. Because now courts, churches, and governments were beginning to take witchcraft very seriously. For centuries, Europeans believed in magic, curses, and supernatural forces. Yet believing in witchcraft was not the same thing as launching large-scale witch hunts. The real danger emerged when powerful institutions became involved. Once churches, courts, and governments began treating witchcraft as a serious criminal offence, accusations that might once have remained local gossip could suddenly become matters of life and death. Ironically, medieval Europe had not always been obsessed with hunting witches. In fact, during much of the early Middle Ages, many church authorities dismissed claims of magical flights, secret gatherings, and supernatural powers as foolish superstitions. The official position was often that people who believed such stories were simply mistaken. That attitude gradually changed. By the late Middle Ages, religious scholars increasingly argued that witches were not merely misguided individuals, they were servants of Satan. This distinction transformed everything. A person accused of using folk magic was one thing. A person accused of actively cooperating with the devil became something far more threatening. Witchcraft was no longer viewed as a simple local problem. It became part of a cosmic struggle between good and evil. The publication of influential texts helped spread these ideas. Scholars, theologians, and church officials wrote extensively about the supposed dangers posed by witches. They described secret meetings, demonic pacts, and elaborate conspiracies against Christian society. Most of these claims had little basis in reality. That did not stop them from being believed. Printing presses helped distribute such ideas across Europe far more efficiently than ever before. What had once been local fears now became shared fears. Meanwhile, governments began paying attention. Local rulers worried about maintaining order. Religious conflicts were already tearing parts of Europe apart. Rebellions, wars, plagues, and economic hardship created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Leaders often saw witch hunting as a way to demonstrate that they were protecting their communities from hidden threats. Judges became increasingly willing to hear witchcraft cases. Laws were rewritten. Investigations expanded. Entire legal systems started treating witchcraft as a crime worthy of prosecution. This created a dangerous cycle. The more authorities searched for witches, the more accusations appeared. The more accusations appeared, the more people believed witches must truly be everywhere. Fear reinforced fear. Each trial seemed to confirm the existence of the threat. Each confession appeared to validate previous accusations. Soon, witch hunting developed a momentum of its own. What had begun as scattered suspicions between neighbours was becoming something much larger. Powerful institutions now stood behind the hunt, armed with courts, prisons, and legal authority. And once an accusation entered that system, escaping it became extraordinarily difficult. Because the process of a witch trial was often designed to find guilt rather than discover truth. Once an accusation of witchcraft was made, events could move with alarming speed. A careless remark, a dead cow, a failed harvest, an argument between neighbours. Any of these might trigger suspicion, and once suspicion became an official accusation, the accused entered a system that was often stacked heavily against them from the very beginning. Contrary to popular belief, witch trials were not identical everywhere. Europe was divided into hundreds of different jurisdictions, each with its own laws, customs, and courts. Some regions pursued witchcraft aggressively. Others remained far more skeptical. Your chances of survival often depended less on the evidence and more on where you happened to live. An unfortunate detail, if you were the accused, the process usually began when someone reported suspicious behaviour. A neighbour might claim that a curse followed an argument. A farmer might blame a failed crop on witchcraft. A family might suspect supernatural involvement after an unexpected death. To modern readers, such accusations often sound absurd. To people living at the time, they could seem entirely plausible. Once authorities became involved, investigators gathered testimony from witnesses. They interviewed neighbours, relatives, and anyone who might possess information about the accused. This was rarely good news. Human beings are excellent at remembering unusual events once they have already decided someone is guilty. Suddenly, every strange comment became suspicious. Every disagreement gained new significance. Every coincidence acquired supernatural meaning. If a woman had argued with a neighbour years earlier, and that neighbour later suffered misfortune, the story might be presented as evidence, not proof. Evidence. The distinction was important. Unfortunately, it was not always respected. Investigators often searched for physical signs supposedly associated with witchcraft. Some believed witches carried special marks placed upon them by the devil. Examinations were conducted in hopes of finding unusual scars, birthmarks, or blemishes. Since nearly every human being possesses some form of scar, mole, or imperfection, these searches often produced exactly what investigators expected to find: a remarkable coincidence. The accused were frequently imprisoned while awaiting trial. Conditions could be harsh. Isolation, fear, uncertainty, and public hostility created immense psychological pressure. Meanwhile, rumours continued spreading throughout the community. People discussed the case. Speculation grew. Witnesses came forward. Some offered genuine testimony. Others repeated gossip they had heard from someone else. The line between fact and rumour gradually blurred, and that was perhaps the greatest danger of all. Because once enough people became convinced of someone's guilt, the trial often shifted away from determining whether the accused was a witch. Instead, it focused on extracting a confession. And that is where the witch hunts entered their darkest chapter. The witch hunts reached their most dangerous stage when authorities became convinced that a confession was the ultimate proof of guilt. The problem, of course, was that people will confess to almost anything under the right circumstances. And witch hunting courts became remarkably skilled at creating those circumstances. Not every region of Europe permitted torture. Some courts were far more cautious than others. But in areas where witch hunts became particularly intense, torture often played a central role in investigations. Authorities believed that witches served the devil, and if witches served the devil, they reasoned, witches would naturally lie to protect themselves. This created a troubling situation. A denial of guilt could be interpreted as proof of innocence, or proof that the accused was lying. Guess which interpretation was usually preferred. The accused often entered prison already frightened, isolated, and uncertain of their fate. They faced judges who believed witches existed, witnesses who repeated rumours, and communities that expected convictions. Under such conditions, resisting accusations became extraordinarily difficult. Then came the interrogations. Some suspects endured endless questioning designed to expose contradictions. Others faced sleep deprivation, threats, or physical torture. European legal systems generally required confessions to secure convictions, but the methods used to obtain those confessions often ensured that one eventually appeared. Human endurance has limits. Pain has a remarkable ability to make impossible stories sound reasonable. Faced with unbearable suffering, many accused individuals admitted to crimes they had never committed. They confessed to flying through the night, attending secret gatherings, making pacts with demons, or casting curses upon neighbours. The details often reflected what interrogators expected to hear. A suspect learned quickly which answers satisfied the court. The result was a strange and tragic cycle. Authorities used confessions as evidence that witches were real. Those confessions inspired further investigations. New suspects were arrested. New confessions followed. Each case appeared to confirm the previous one. The system fed itself. False testimony also became a major problem. Children accused adults. Neighbours accused neighbours. Family members sometimes testified against relatives. Some witnesses genuinely believed what they were saying. Others acted out of fear, revenge, or self-preservation. Once accusation spread through a community, suspicion could become contagious. Nobody wanted to appear sympathetic toward a suspected witch. Doing so could attract suspicion toward yourself. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the witch hunts is that many confessions survive in written records today. Reading them, historians often see not evidence of witchcraft, but evidence of human desperation. People saying whatever they thought might end their suffering. Yet instead of ending the panic, these confessions helped push the witch hunts towards their most destructive phase. The Great Witch Hunt frenzy had only just begun. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the witch hunts had grown far beyond isolated accusations. What had once been a local dispute between neighbours was becoming a widespread social panic. Entire communities became convinced that witches were everywhere, and once people started looking for witches, they found them. Or at least they believed they did. This was the period when the witch hunts reached their peak. Across parts of Europe, especially within the fragmented states of the Holy Roman Empire, large-scale investigations began sweeping through towns and villages. Courts arrested dozens of suspects at a time. Some investigations expanded until hundreds of people fell under suspicion. The panic often followed a familiar pattern. Authorities arrested a suspected witch. Under interrogation, the accused confessed and named accomplices. Those accomplices were arrested. They, in turn, confessed and named others. Soon the list of suspects grew faster than anyone could verify it. The process resembled a snowball rolling downhill. Every confession created new accusations. Every accusation generated new fear. Every fear encouraged further investigations. Communities became trapped inside a cycle that seemed impossible to stop. One of the most frightening aspects of these panics was how quickly social trust collapsed. Neighbours who had lived beside one another for decades suddenly became suspicious. Families worried about relatives. Friends questioned friends. The ordinary relationships that held communities together began to unravel. Imagine living in a village where any careless comment might be repeated before a magistrate, where a personal disagreement could become an accusation, where a rumour might destroy your reputation overnight. Many people learned that silence felt safer than honesty. The panic spared few social classes. Poor farmers were accused. Wealthy landowners were accused. Craftsmen, merchants, priests, and local officials all found themselves under suspicion in certain regions. Once fear gained momentum, social status offered no guaranteed protection. In some places, entire networks of imaginary witches emerged through forced confessions. Authorities became convinced they had uncovered vast conspiracies stretching across multiple towns and villages. The irony was devastating. The more investigators searched for evidence of organised witchcraft, the more they created the illusion that such organisations existed. Confessions produced names. Names produced arrests. Arrests produced more confessions. The cycle continued. Yet even at the height of the panic, not everyone accepted these claims. Some judges, scholars, and religious leaders began expressing doubts. They noticed contradictions. They questioned the reliability of confessions. They wondered whether innocent people were being condemned. At first, those voices remained a minority. But over time, skepticism would grow stronger, and eventually, it would help bring one of history's most tragic panics to an end. For more than a century, the witch hunts seemed unstoppable. Thousands had been accused. Thousands had confessed. Thousands had died. And yet, by the late 17th century, something remarkable began to happen. People started asking questions. Not questions about witches, questions about the witch hunts themselves. The change did not occur overnight. There was no single moment when Europe collectively decided it had made a terrible mistake. Instead, skepticism spread slowly, one judge, one scholar, and one court case at a time. The very success of the witch hunts had created a problem. The accusations had become too large, too bizarre, and too difficult to believe. Some investigations claimed that entire villages contained witches. Others uncovered supposed conspiracies involving dozens or even hundreds of people. Confessions described impossible events, supernatural journeys, and meetings attended by enormous numbers of participants. At a certain point, even believers began to have doubts. The story simply became too unbelievable. Judges noticed another troubling pattern. Confessions obtained under torture often contradicted one another. Witnesses changed their stories. Accusations spread through rumour rather than evidence. Cases that seemed convincing at first often fell apart under closer examination. Some legal authorities started demanding stronger proof. This was a crucial shift. For generations, suspicion had often been enough to begin an investigation. Now, courts increasingly required actual evidence. And evidence, unfortunately for the witch hunters, was much harder to find than rumours. At the same time, intellectual life in Europe was changing. The scientific revolution encouraged people to seek natural explanations for events that previous generations might have attributed to supernatural causes. Scholars studied astronomy, medicine, physics, and biology with growing confidence. A failed harvest no longer required a witch. A disease outbreak no longer demanded a curse. Nature itself could provide explanations. Religious leaders also became more cautious. Some clergy worried that innocent people were being condemned. Others feared that excessive witch hunting was damaging the credibility of the church itself. Meanwhile, governments increasingly viewed large witch panics as threats to public order. Authorities who once encouraged investigations now began restricting them. Laws were revised. Standards of evidence were raised. Torture became more limited, or was abolished entirely in some regions. Without torture, mass confessions became much rarer. Without confessions, large-scale witch hunts struggled to sustain themselves. Gradually, the panic faded. Not because people stopped believing in magic overnight, but because more and more people realized that fear was a poor substitute for evidence. And once that realization spread, one of history's darkest chapters slowly came to a close. When people think about the witch hunts today, they often imagine a simple story. Ignorant people believed in witches. Innocent victims suffered. Eventually, reason prevailed. While there is some truth in that summary, history reveals a far more complex and unsettling reality. The witch hunts were not driven solely by ignorance. Many of the judges, scholars, priests, and government officials involved were educated by the standards of their time. They could read Latin, study theology, debate legal theory, and administer complex institutions. Some of them genuinely believed they were protecting society. That is one of the most uncomfortable lessons history offers. Terrible injustices are not always committed by obviously evil people. Sometimes they are carried out by ordinary individuals convinced they are doing the right thing. Modern historians have spent decades studying surviving court records, letters, and legal documents. These sources reveal that the witch hunts varied enormously from place to place. Some regions experienced devastating waves of accusations. Others saw very few trials. Some judges aggressively pursued suspects. Others actively resisted panic and dismissed weak cases. Human decisions mattered. The witch hunts were not inevitable. Historians have also challenged many popular myths. Contrary to popular belief, most executions for witchcraft did not occur during the Middle Ages. The largest witch hunts happened during the early modern period, particularly between the 16th and 17th centuries. Likewise, not every victim was a healer, midwife, or wise woman. Many were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Some were targeted because they were outsiders, others because they were unpopular. Still, others simply found themselves trapped in communities overwhelmed by fear. Perhaps the most important discovery is that witch hunts tell us less about witches and more about people. They reveal how fear spreads, how rumors grow, how communities react during times of uncertainty, how easily suspicion can replace evidence. The victims themselves came from different backgrounds, religions, and social classes, but they shared one tragic characteristic. They lived in societies that became convinced a hidden threat existed, and once that belief took hold, facts struggled to compete with fear. That lesson remains relevant today. Technology has changed. Governments have changed. The world has changed. Human nature has not changed nearly as much as we sometimes like to believe. The witch hunts remind us that fear can be contagious, that certainty can be dangerous, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Most importantly, they remind us of the cost when societies stop asking difficult questions and start accepting accusations without proof. The witch hunts ended centuries ago. The prisons are gone. The trials are over. The execution sites have long since fallen silent. Yet the legacy of the witch hunts remains surprisingly powerful.